I had finally done it. After years of living paycheck to paycheck, I had saved up enough to buy my first home. It wasn't the mansion I had always dreamed of, but it was perfect for me. A 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a cozy front yard and a backyard that I could actually use. It was in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, just far enough from the city to escape the noise, but close enough for a short commute. It was everything I had worked for. At first glance, everything about the neighborhood seemed ideal. The houses were well kept, the streets lined with trees, and the lawns were green and manicured to perfection. Children rode their bikes up and down the sidewalk while older residents waved to each other from their porches. There was a sense of calm here, a feeling that people cared about their homes and their community. It was the kind of place where you could picture yourself growing old, where neighbors knew each other's names and the only thing you had to worry about was what time to start the grill for the weekend BBQ. But of course, nothing is ever as perfect as it seems, and if you're moving into a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, HOA, it's usually only a matter of time before you start to see the cracks in the facade. When I signed the paperwork and received the keys to my new home, I was handed a thick packet titled, "Welcome to the Community, HOA Guidelines and Regulations." It was everything I never knew I needed to read and more. A 75-page guide detailing everything from how many trees I was allowed to have on my property, 3, no more, to the exact shade of gray that was considered acceptable for front door paint, Benjamin Moore's soft granite, naturally. The list of rules was endless and meticulous. There were restrictions on the type of lawn ornaments you could have, the exact angle your driveway needed to be aligned with, and of course an entire section dedicated to the proper height for your mailbox. I skimmed through it, rolling my eyes at some of the absurdities, but figuring it would be fine. How much trouble could I possibly get into for simply living in a house? But the truth was, I didn't understand the full scope of what I was getting into. Then came Karen. I first met her a week after I moved in. She was the HOA president, or at least that's what she liked to tell everyone. She was the kind of person who seemed to walk with an invisible crown on her head, a woman who thought her opinion mattered more than anyone else's. Her house was the nicest on the block, or at least it looked that way. It was meticulously maintained, with perfectly symmetrical hedges and a porch so pristine it could have been a set piece for a real estate ad. Karen was always out front, clipboard in hand, making sure her house stayed exactly as perfect as it was supposed to be. She introduced herself with a smile that was a little too wide, and I quickly learned that she took the HOA rules very, very seriously. In fact, she took them so seriously that she might as well have been their enforcer. If anyone even looked like they were about to break one of the regulations, Karen was there with her ever-present clipboard and a warning. "Hi there. Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, shaking my hand as though she was greeting a new recruit. "I'm Karen, the HOA president. I just wanted to stop by and remind you about a few things. You know, just the usual." I didn't think much of it at the time, figuring she was just being friendly. After all, she did seem like the kind of person who liked to keep things orderly. But soon enough, I realized that Karen wasn't just concerned with keeping things orderly. She was obsessed with control. Within the first 2 weeks of me moving in, I received my first warning letter from the HOA. I had no idea what to expect. Was it going to be about my lawn? Maybe my trash cans were out too long. No, it was far more ridiculous than that. "Dear homeowner, we've noticed that your welcome mat is not in accordance with community standards. Please remove it immediately to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." I stood there staring at the letter, confused. A welcome mat? Was I seriously getting fined for a welcome mat? It wasn't even a crazy design, just a simple welcome mat, plain black with white lettering. But apparently it wasn't up to snuff, according to Karen and the HOA's guidelines. The mat was unsophisticated and didn't reflect the high standards of the community. I was stunned. It was my first real interaction with the HOA, and it wasn't even about something that mattered. Who could possibly care about a welcome mat? Still, I wasn't going to let it slide. I tried to call the HOA office, but Karen was the only one I ever seemed to get on the phone. She was always polite, always pleasant, but there was a certain coldness to her that rubbed me the wrong way. Her response was that the rules were clear and couldn't be bent for anyone. "You'll get used to it," she said with a smile. "We just want to keep the neighborhood looking beautiful. You understand, don't you?" At that moment, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about keeping things neat. This was about power. Karen had created an environment where she could dictate every aspect of my life, and the worst part was that she seemed to enjoy it. But at that point, I still didn't realize just how deep this problem went. I thought it was just a one-time issue, that I had somehow just slipped up. But as the days went by, I'd come to learn the truth. The HOA and Karen weren't just watching the community, they were controlling it. Till Obidar, I moved into my dream home, only to quickly discover that the neighborhood HOA was run by Karen, the self-appointed queen of the community. She gave me my first taste of her control freak tendencies when she fined me for something as harmless as a welcome mat. Little did I know, this would be the beginning of a nightmare I would soon have to fight back against. The first warning letter was bad, but I figured it was just a minor misunderstanding. Maybe they were just overzealous with their rules. I followed Karen's advice and removed my welcome mat, because clearly that was more important than, I don't know, actual issues like community safety or upkeep. I figured I had done my part in maintaining the harmony of the neighborhood, but I was wrong. Just a few days later, the second notice arrived. This one wasn't about something trivial like a doormat, but it hit a lot harder. I opened the envelope, and the first line made my blood boil. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your front bushes have exceeded the community-approved height limit. As per Section 3.2 of the HOA's guidelines, you are required to trim your bushes by 48 hours to avoid further action." I stood there staring at the paper, trying to wrap my head around what I had just read. The bushes were fine. Sure, they weren't perfectly trimmed, but they weren't anywhere near overgrown. They were just average-sized shrubs that provided a little privacy and shade to the front porch. I didn't understand how they could be a problem, especially when half the neighbors had bushes in worse condition, or at least as overgrown as mine. I immediately called Karen. "Hello, this is Karen from the HOA. How can I help you today?" Her voice was so sweet and polite, like honey mixed with a touch of passive aggression. "Karen, this is ridiculous," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My bushes are fine. I've trimmed them several times. Why am I getting a fine for this?" "Oh, sweetie, I totally understand your frustration. But you see, the HOA guidelines are very specific about what's allowed, and your bushes are just a bit too tall," Karen replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "You can certainly trim them yourself, or we can have someone come by to do it for you. But either way, the fine still stands unless it's taken care of." I felt my blood pressure rising. "I'm not going to let you fine me for something that's completely arbitrary. This is insane. You've got to be kidding." Karen sighed dramatically. "Listen, honey, I really don't want to escalate this. It's just a small thing. But the rules are the rules, and we all have to follow them. If you really feel like the fine is unfair, you can appeal it at the next HOA meeting, but it'll still be due by the end of the week." The call ended, and I was left fuming. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew one thing. This wasn't just about my bushes. The LOA had started to treat the community like their personal playground, and I was their latest target. I didn't want to become another victim of this absurd system, but it was clear that unless I fought back, they would keep pushing and pushing. I decided to take action. I went outside to inspect my bushes one more time, just to see if they were truly out of line. As I stood there, eyeing them from every angle, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Every house on the block had some sort of vegetation, and almost all of them had bushes that were 8 of the same size as mine or worse. This wasn't just about my landscaping. It was about control. It was about Karen and the HOA having their fingers in every aspect of our lives. I was mad, no, furious, but I didn't know where to start. The rules were so strict and the penalties so high that I didn't want to risk pushing back without knowing what I was up against. So I decided to do some research. The next day, I walked around the neighborhood, subtly taking notes on the condition of other people's lawns, bushes, and mailboxes. I was stunned at how many houses had violations just like mine. A neighbor down the street had a mailbox that was clearly leaning to one side, but I hadn't heard any complaints about it. Another neighbor's fence was visibly crooked, but there wasn't any mention of it in the newsletters. Why was my house being singled out? I took these observations back home and started researching the HOA rules more closely. There were certain things in the documents that didn't sit right with me. The guidelines were vague, and I quickly realized that there was a pattern. The HOA didn't seem to care about enforcing the rules equally. It was like they just picked people to target and sent out fines, hoping they'd comply. And Karen was at the center of it all, making sure that anyone who dared challenge the status quo was put in their place. As I dug deeper into the bylaws and local property codes, I learned something that made my blood run cold. The LOA had far more power than I had initially realized. They could fine me for almost anything, and if I didn't pay, they had the legal right to put a lion on my property. Worse still, they could force me to sell my house if they deemed me non-compliant. It was a nightmare. That's when I made up my mind. I wasn't going to roll over and accept this. I wasn't going to let Karen and her HOA cronies push me around. I had just bought this house, and I was going to fight for it, even if it meant going head-to-head with the HOA. I started keeping records of every interaction I had with the HOA. I wrote down every phone call, every email, and every warning letter. I wasn't just fighting for my front bushes anymore. I was fighting for my home. The stakes had been raised, and there was no turning back. TLDR. After receiving a fine for my front bushes being too tall, I realized the HOA was targeting me for petty reasons and using their power to control every little detail of my life. The more I investigated, the clearer it became that the HOA wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. They were about control. I decided to fight back, knowing that I couldn't let Karen and her cronies dictate how I lived in my own home. I thought I had gotten off easy after that second warning about the bushes. Sure, it was frustrating, but I figured the worst had passed. I trimmed my bushes, made sure they were well below the height limit, and tried to go about my life. But it didn't take long before the HOA found something else to target. I should have known better. If Karen and the HOA had their sights set on me, there was no escaping their reach. It all started with a notice in the mail. This time, it wasn't about my landscaping or a mailbox. It was about my driveway. Yes, my driveway. The letter stated that the concrete driveway needed to be professionally cleaned because there were stains on it that were not up to community standards. I was floored. There were a few faint oil spots from my car, sure, but nothing that couldn't be easily scrubbed off. My driveway was hardly a mess, but apparently to Karen and the HOA, even the smallest imperfection was enough to issue another fine. Dear homeowner, please be advised that your driveway does not meet the community's aesthetic standards. A $100 fine will be imposed if the issue is not corrected within 14 days. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A fine for a few oil spots on my driveway. My neighbors, as I had observed, didn't have pristine, sparkling driveways. A few had visible stains and cracks. No one was getting fined. Why was I being singled out? I called the HOA immediately, and as expected, Karen picked up the phone. Her voice was like silk, smooth, practiced, and completely devoid of empathy. "Hello, this is Karen. How can I help you today?" she said cheerfully, as if she hadn't just delivered the most ridiculous fine I had ever seen. "I just got this notice about my driveway. I started trying to keep my frustration in check. You're fining me $100 for a few oil stains." "Oh, sweetie," Karen said in her overly sweet tone, "it's not just about the oil stains. It's about maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. We want to keep everything looking nice. You know how it is, right?" "Nice? It's a driveway, Karen," I practically shouted. "It's not meant to be a showroom floor. No one else is getting fined for this." "Well, darling, it's all about fairness," Karen replied, unfazed. "The HOA is here to ensure that everyone maintains their property to the same standard. And unfortunately, Your driveway doesn't meet the criteria." I was so angry, I could feel my hands shaking. "This is ridiculous. My driveway is fine. I'll clean it when I get the chance, but you're not going to fine me for something so trivial." "Oh, but I'm afraid we don't make exceptions, dear. The fine will remain. If you like, you can appeal it at the next meeting." "Fine," I said, gritting my teeth. "I'll appeal it." I hung up the phone, steam practically coming out of my ears. But I wasn't just going to sit back and take this. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was about fighting back against an organization that thought it had the right to control every part of my life. I wasn't the only one being targeted, though. That was when I realized just how bad things were getting. Over the next few days, I began talking to my neighbors, carefully at first, not wanting to seem like I was stirring up trouble. But to my surprise, many of them had similar stories to mine. They were all quietly dissatisfied with the HOA, but none of them had the courage to speak out. Bob, my neighbor across the street, was one of the first to open up. Bob had been living in the neighborhood for years, and he was fed up. He told me that the HOA had fined him for all sorts of trivial things. His lawn ornaments were too whimsical, his mailbox was not uniform with the others, and his front door was the wrong shade of blue. The fines were small, but they added up over time, and he was getting to the point where he could barely afford to pay them anymore. Bob had even tried to file complaints, but every time he did, Karen would just shoot him down with some convoluted excuse about community standards. "I've had it with them," Bob said one night while we were chatting in front of our houses. "It's like they're just looking for reasons to charge us." It was in that moment that I realized the HOA's strategy. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was trying to generate revenue. Every fine, no matter how small, was a way to pad the HOA's coffers. The more they could charge homeowners, the more power they held over us. And if we didn't comply, they could levy even worse penalties, things like property liens, which would make it nearly impossible to sell our homes. It was a form of quiet, legal extortion. The more I heard, the angrier I became, and I knew it wasn't just me and Bob. I wasn't the only one who had received fines or been hassled by Karen. I decided to dig deeper. I started researching the HOA's bylaws and found something troubling. The rules they were enforcing weren't consistent. Some properties had violations that went unnoticed, while others were scrutinized down to the smallest detail. It wasn't about maintaining a uniform community. It was about power, control, and money. That's when I realized I couldn't just keep fighting these small issues. It was time to escalate things. Till year, the HOA continued to target me with unreasonable fines, this time for something as trivial as a few oil stains on my driveway. As I started talking to my neighbors, I discovered that many of them were also frustrated by the HOA's unfair tactics. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This was all part of a bigger scheme to extort money from homeowners. I couldn't sit idly by any longer. It was time to fight back. Things were spiraling out of control fast. What started as a minor issue with a welcome mat and a few oil stains on my driveway had now turned into a full-blown battle with the HOA. The fines, the warnings, and the constant harassment were wearing me down. Every time I thought I had gotten past one issue, another one popped up. And Karen, the HOA president, was always right there, acting like she had the power to dictate every aspect of my life. The final straw came when I received a letter from the HOA that made my blood run cold. It wasn't about my lawn or my mailbox this time. It wasn't even about a petty rule violation. No, this time, the HOA was threatening something much more severe: foreclosure. The letter, which was written in an overly formal and vaguely threatening tone, claimed that I had fallen behind on my HOA dues, and that if I didn't pay the outstanding balance within 30 days, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings on my home. The amount? Less than $500. I froze when I read it. Foreclosure. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This wasn't about my bushes or driveway. The HOA was now threatening to take my home from me over a small amount of money I could pay, but hadn't been able to due to the absurd fines that kept piling up. I had been doing everything I could to stay on top of these fees, but every time I paid one, Another one seemed to appear. I had already paid off a few fines, but the total was mounting faster than I could keep up. I felt completely trapped. The power the OA had over my life was suffocating, and Karen had made it crystal clear that if I didn't comply with every demand, no matter how unreasonable, they would stop at nothing to take my house. I immediately called the HOA office, my heart pounding in my chest. Of course, Karen answered the phone. "Hello, this is Karen. How can I assist you today?" "Karen, what the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just threaten me with foreclosure over a few fines." Now, calm down," Karen said as though she were speaking to a misbehaving child. "This is simply a formality. We've sent you multiple notices, and unfortunately, you've ignored them." "I didn't ignore them. I've been paying the fines, and you keep sending new ones. This isn't about the fines anymore, Karen. It's about your ability to bully people into submission." "Oh, sweetie, I'm just doing my job," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The OOA has guidelines that need to be followed, and the fees are part of maintaining the integrity of our community. You wouldn't want to see the property values drop because someone isn't paying their dues, would you?" I could feel my blood boiling. This isn't about property values. This is about control. You're trying to steal my home because I've got a few outstanding fines. This is extortion. Karen's voice remained calm and unbothered. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. The HOA is simply enforcing its rules to ensure that everyone in the community is treated fairly. You're welcome to dispute the fines at the next board meeting, but the fees are still due." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to pay the fines, but now the HOA was going too far. Foreclosure? This wasn't just a tactic to force compliance. This was an outright attack on my ability to live in my own home. I knew then that I had to fight back, not just for my home, but for my sanity. I started researching my options. I didn't have much time, but I needed to know how far the HOA could legally push me. I wasn't going to let Karen and the HOA bully me into submission, no matter what it took. The more I dug, the angrier I became. There were legal precedents that said HOAs could not just go around threatening foreclosure over small fines, but I wasn't a lawyer. I needed professional help, and fast. I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property law. After explaining my situation, he told me that the HOA was on shaky legal ground. They couldn't just come after my house for a few $100s. Foreclosure was a drastic step that could only be taken under very specific circumstances, like non-payment of mortgage payments, not petty fines. The lawyer told me that he could help me file an injunction to block the foreclosure proceedings, but it would take time, and time was running out. Despite the legal advice, I still felt powerless. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. The FOA had overstepped their bounds in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first moved in. It wasn't just a few annoying rules. It was a system of control, a way for Karen and the HOA to take power from homeowners like me and wield it to their advantage. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I had to gather support. That's when I decided to talk to my neighbors again. I had learned over time that I wasn't the only one feeling the pressure from the HOA. Bob had already been hit with multiple fines for trivial issues, and I knew several others in the neighborhood who had been intimidated into paying fines just to avoid trouble. I also knew that most of them didn't want to risk their homes being targeted by the HOA, but I hoped that, together, we could stand up to Karen and the rest of the board. I started by organizing a small meeting at my house. Bob, a few other neighbors, and I gathered in my living room. I shared my story, and as I did, I saw their faces change. They weren't the only ones dealing with this. The HOA had been creeping into their lives too, slowly but surely. "We can't let this go on," I said, my voice growing stronger. "We have to stand up for ourselves. If we don't, Karen and the HOA will continue to bully us all." Bob nodded. "I've had enough. It's time someone stood up to them." That was the moment I knew we were about to enter a fight we couldn't back down from. The FOA had underestimated us, and now we were going to make sure they felt the consequences. Till Vidar. The LOA threatened foreclosure on my home over a small fine, pushing me to the breaking point. As I reached out to a lawyer for help, I realized that I wasn't the only one being targeted by Karen and the HOA. I started organizing my neighbors, hoping to band together and fight back against the tyranny of the HOA before it was too late. By the time I reached out to the lawyer, I knew I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This was bigger than me. The LOA wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was an authoritarian force in our community, and if I didn't do something, it would continue to control our lives. I couldn't let that happen. The lawyer I hired was a seasoned property rights attorney named Karen Walters. Yes, I found the irony in her name too. She was blunt, no nonsense, and most importantly, she understood how far HOAs could go in their overreach. After a consultation, Karen gave me some hope. Technically, they're not allowed to push you to foreclosure over these fines, she explained, her fingers tapping away on her laptop as she went over the bylaws. They can't just kick you out of your home because of small, arbitrary fines, especially when those fines are being applied unfairly. What they're doing is an abuse of power, and that's something we can work with. She explained that the HOA was in a gray legal area when it came to foreclosure over minor violations. It was illegal for them to go that far without proving some kind of long-standing neglect or failure to comply with legitimate rules. Most importantly, the law was on my side. The HOA couldn't just pick and choose who to enforce their rules against, especially when others in the neighborhood were clearly in violation of similar things. But the lawyer also made it clear that fighting back wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just about having the law on my side. Karen and the rest of the HOA board were probably going to fight tooth and nail, dragging things out as long as they could. This was going to be a battle, and I needed to be ready. As if on cue, the HOA's next move arrived a week later in the form of another letter. This one was about my appeal. They had scheduled a hearing for me at the upcoming HOA board meeting, where I would have a chance to explain why my fines were unjust. I could already hear Karen's voice in my head. Just follow the rules, honey, and we can make this all go away. But I wasn't planning to go in there and apologize or beg. I was going to make them realize that they couldn't keep pushing people around with their power. In preparation for the meeting, I started gathering as much evidence as I could. I took photos of my driveway, showing that the stains were barely noticeable, let alone a violation of any community standards. I made a detailed list of every single fine I had received from the HOA, each one more ridiculous than the last, and compared them with other neighbors' properties. As I suspected, there were numerous violations in the neighborhood that hadn't been addressed. Bob and some of the other neighbors who had been targeted by the HOA agreed to join me in this fight. We compiled a list of similar issues in the neighborhood: cracked driveways, poorly maintained fences, unkempt lawns. I even went as far as documenting some of the more questionable fines others had received, things like mailboxes not matching the approved color scheme, and a neighbor being fined for a bird bath that disrupted the community's aesthetic harmony. The hypocrisy was glaring, and I was determined to expose it. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air as I stepped into the small, sterile conference room. The board members were seated at a long table, all of them wearing the same bland, authoritarian expressions. And there, sitting at the head of the table, was Karen, the queen of this little kingdom. She greeted me with a tight smile, but there was an edge in her eyes that told me she wasn't happy to see me there. The other board members gave me curt nods, but none of them said anything. It felt like I had walked into the lion's den. "Thank you for joining us today, homeowner," Karen began, her voice too sweet for comfort. "We're here to discuss the issues at hand, including your recent fines and your appeal. Let's try to keep this respectful, shall we?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my calm. This wasn't the time to lose my temper. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today," I said, forcing a polite smile. "But I have some serious concerns about how the HOA is enforcing its rules." Karen raised an eyebrow. "I see. Would you like to begin by explaining why you think the fines you've received are unfair?" I could feel the weight of the moment. I wasn't just defending myself. I was defending the community. everyone who had been mistreated by this HOA. Sure, I said, setting out my prepared evidence. First, I'd like to show you the photos of my driveway. You'll see that the oil stains are barely visible, and they certainly don't warrant the fine I received. I passed around the photos to the board members, watching as they looked over the evidence. Some seemed uncomfortable, but Karen just waved it off. It's not about how visible the stains are. It's about maintaining the standard of the community. I wasn't backing down. Well, if that's the case, then why aren't other properties in violation being addressed? Several of my neighbors have similar issues, but they haven't been fined. Why is that? The room went silent for a moment, and I could see Karen's facade cracking just a little. She shifted in her seat, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. We enforce the rules equally across the community, she said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. I wasn't finished. I continued, pointing to the documentation I had gathered. And if that's the case, then why are these fines being applied so selectively? The HOA is singling out homeowners like me while letting others get away with violations. This isn't about fairness. This is about power. At this point, I could tell that the other board members were starting to get uneasy. They weren't used to someone pushing back like this. Karen, however, remained defiant. Well, I'm afraid the rules are the rules, she said, standing her ground. And if you don't want to pay, we'll just have to proceed with the necessary action. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. If you do that, I will take legal action. I've already spoken to an attorney. This is an abuse of power, and I'll fight it until the end. The room went quiet. I could tell I had struck a nerve. TLBVR. With the threat of foreclosure looming, I decided to fight back. I gathered evidence, reached out to a lawyer, and organized a small group of neighbors to stand up against the HOA's unreasonable fines. When I went to the board meeting, I came prepared with proof of their unfair enforcement of rules, and I made it clear that I was ready to take legal action if they didn't back down. The tension in the room was palpable, and it was clear that Karen and the board weren't prepared for a fight like this. The showdown at the HOA meeting didn't go quite as I expected. I had been prepared for them to brush me off, for Karen to throw her usual condescending lines at me, but what I wasn't prepared for was the subtle shift that started to happen in the room. For the first time, I saw cracks in Karen's iron grip on the board. It started with the other members. They sat at the table, their eyes flickering from me to Karen, clearly uncomfortable with the standoff that was unfolding. Karen had always been the one in charge, the one who could dictate the terms and control the meetings. But that night, it was different. Maybe it was the way I'd presented my case, or maybe it was the lawyer I had threatened to bring in, but I could sense that they were starting to question her leadership, and that gave me hope. Are we really going to take this that far? One of the board members, Dave, asked cautiously. He was the treasurer, and from what I gathered, he wasn't nearly as zealous about enforcing every single rule as Karen was. I mean, a $500 fine and a few oil stains. It doesn't seem worth the trouble, does it? Karen's jaw tightened, and I could see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She was used to having complete control over every decision, but now she was starting to lose her footing. We have a duty to the community, she snapped, clearly rattled. These fines are in place to maintain the integrity of our neighborhood. We can't just let people get away with violations because they think they can pay their way out of it. I could tell that she was trying to regain her authority, but it wasn't working. Dave wasn't buying it. Karen, I'm not saying we shouldn't have rules, he said, his tone more measured now, but it's becoming pretty clear that these fines are being applied inconsistently. If we're going to enforce things like this, it has to be fair for everyone, and it doesn't feel fair to me. That was it. The floodgates opened. Other board members began to speak up too, pointing out similar inconsistencies in enforcement. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the turning point. You know, said Linda, a soft-spoken member who had never really said much at past meetings, I've noticed that too. There are properties in the neighborhood that are just as bad, if not worse, than this one, but they've never been fined. How do we justify that? The pressure was building, and Karen could feel it. She shot back quickly, trying to regain control. This isn't the issue at hand. We're discussing this homeowner's fines, not the entire neighborhood. We're not here to discuss every violation, but it was too late. The other board members were already on her side. Dave, Linda, and a couple of others started asking questions about the fairness of the process. A few were even looking at Karen as if they had been duped by her manipulation all this time. The balance of power in that room had shifted. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The support from the board members who spoke up gave me strength, and I wasn't about to let that opportunity slip away. I addressed the board again, more confidently now. I don't want special treatment. All I'm asking for is fairness. If the HOA is going to enforce these rules, they need to be applied consistently. It's not about one small fine. It's about the principle. And right now, it's clear that the HOA has been abusing its power. Karen's face had gone pale by this point, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was panicking. The HOA was her kingdom, and I was threatening to tear it all down. I'll tell you what, I said, if you want to keep enforcing these rules the way you have been, then we'll let the community decide. I'm sure the residents would appreciate having a chance to voice their opinions, don't you think? That was the final nail in the coffin. I knew that Karen and the rest of the board didn't want the community involved. The idea of a revolt, of residents becoming aware of the abuses that had been going on, was too much for them to handle, and it was something they could never control. The board meeting concluded with no resolution. The fines remained for the moment, but the cracks in the HOA's structure were undeniable. The next day, I went home feeling like I had won a small but significant victory. I hadn't won the war yet, but I had opened up a real path to defeat Karen and her clique. Building support. The following days were a whirlwind. I knew the next step was to gain as much support as I could from my neighbors. The board meeting had been a breakthrough, but it was clear that Karen would not go down easily. She would fight back, and I needed to be ready. I started talking to more and more of my neighbors, gathering them together in small groups to share stories and grievances. I knew that many of them were afraid to speak out, worried about retribution from the HOA, but I also knew that they were fed up with Karen's constant overreach. People like Bob, who had been fined for ridiculous things like lawn ornaments and a slightly faded fence, were more than willing to join in the fight. We weren't just battling for one person anymore. We were fighting for everyone. I also reached out to some of the residents who had been with the HOA for a long time. Some were former board members, others just long-time homeowners who had seen the transformation of the neighborhood over the years. A few were wary at first, not wanting to rock the boat, but when I explained how this wasn't just about me, but about the future of the community, they began to come around. It didn't take long for word to spread. The more people I talked to, the more I realized just how many of my neighbors had been quietly suffering under the thumb of the HOA. Some of them had even been too afraid to speak out, fearing fines, public shaming, or worse, being targeted by the board. But now they were ready to stand up. TLDR. After my confrontation at the HOA meeting, the balance of power began to shift. Several board members, including Dave and Linda, started questioning Karen's approach, and the other members began to voice concerns about the fairness of the HOA's practices. I seized the opportunity to push for community involvement and make it clear that if the board didn't reform, the residents would get a say. This marked the beginning of the end for Karen's iron grip on the HOA. Now it was time to rally the neighbors and build a united front. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The HOA, despite their previous attempts to intimidate me and others, had no idea what was coming for them. What had started as a simple confrontation over fines and rules had now grown into a full-scale rebellion, one that would expose the abuse of power and unfair treatment many residents had suffered for years. After the HOA board meeting, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for them to make the next move. I had to strike while the iron was hot. The cracks in their authority were growing, and I had to capitalize on it. The residents who had shown support, along with a few courageous neighbors who were willing to publicly back me up, were ready for action. I began by organizing a formal petition to present at the next HOA meeting. The goal was simple. We were demanding that the board hold a public vote on the current fines, the enforcement practices, and Karen's leadership. People had had enough. No longer were they willing to cower in silence. It was time to take back control of their community. I worked tirelessly with Bob, Linda, and a few other outspoken neighbors to gather signatures. The petition didn't just address my personal situation. It called for a full review of the HOA's practices, including an investigation into whether the board had been operating legally. In fact, we were pushing for transparency. We wanted the residents to know where their fees were going and why certain rules were being enforced selectively. By the time the next HOA meeting came around, we had gathered over 70 signatures from residents, an impressive number for a community of about 200 homes. That's when I knew we had the momentum. There was no turning back now. The night of the meeting, I walked into the same stereo conference room, but this time I wasn't alone. There was a palpable energy in the air. Bob, Linda, and a few of the other neighbors had come to support me. Their presence was a powerful statement, a clear indication that the residents were ready to challenge the status quo. Even the board members seemed nervous. They were aware of the growing resistance, and I could feel their discomfort as I entered the room with the petition in hand. Karen was already at her usual spot at the head of the table. She looked even more tense than usual, her eyes darting around the room as she prepared for the meeting. But something was different tonight. She wasn't the untouchable leader she had been in the past. She was starting to realize that her reign was coming to an end. The meeting began, and Karen quickly launched into her usual spiel about community standards and the importance of upholding the rules. But this time, the room wasn't as receptive. People were looking around, whispering to each other, and exchanging knowing glances. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up, the petition in hand, and I felt the eyes of every single person in the room on me. "Good evening, everyone," I began, trying to keep my voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm here tonight to address the ongoing issues with the HOA and to formally present a petition signed by over 70 of our neighbors. This petition demands that we review the practices of this board, as well as the fines and policies that have been implemented in our community." Karen's face turned an odd shade of pale, but she remained silent. The rest of the board members were looking at each other, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. They had never seen this kind of organized resistance before. "I have been dealing with this HOA for far too long," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I've been threatened with foreclosure over trivial fines, while other homes in this neighborhood have been allowed to violate the same rules without consequence. This is not about fairness. This is about power, and it's time for that to change." I paused, letting my words sink in. A few neighbors nodded in agreement. The petition I had presented was a tangible symbol of our collective power, and it was clear that the board members realized they were losing control. "And it's not just about me," I went on. "Many of us here have been unfairly targeted by this HOA. Whether it's over minor property issues or fines that were never explained properly, we have all suffered under this system. The community deserves better. We need transparency, fairness, and accountability." Karen finally spoke, her voice trembling with irritation. "You are out of line," she said, glaring at me. "These are rules, and they must be enforced. If you don't want to follow them, then you should leave the community. No one is forcing you to stay here." That was it. That was the final straw. The room went silent, but it was a silence filled with tension and anger. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but they didn't speak. For the first time, they were realizing that their position of power was slipping through their fingers. "I've had enough," I said, taking a deep breath. "You're not going to bully me anymore, and you're not going to bully my neighbors. If you think you can continue this, you're mistaken. This is no longer about individual fines. It's about whether or not we can trust this HOA to represent the interests of the community." I turned to the other residents who had shown up in support. "If you stand with me, if you want real change, we need to vote tonight. We need to take control of this community and put an end to Karen's reign of terror." It was clear that the momentum was on our side. More and more people began to stand, voicing their agreement with what I had said. The room erupted into murmurs of support, and for the first time, Karen and the board members were on the defensive. "We'll call for a vote," one of the board members said hesitantly, his voice shaky. "But this isn't over. You can't just change the rules because you don't like them." "No, but we can demand that they be fair," I responded sharply. The vote was called, and one by one, the board members began to realize they were losing their grip. The motion to review the HOA's policies and leadership was passed. The power had shifted. It was no longer just Karen's word against mine. It was a united front of homeowners, all demanding transparency and fairness. TLDR. The final confrontation with the HOA board was intense. With the petition in hand and overwhelming support from my neighbors, I demanded a vote on the board's leadership and practices. Karen tried to brush us off, but the community was united, and the vote passed. The HOA's grip on power was slipping, and change was finally on the horizon. It was a major turning point in the battle for fairness and accountability. The aftermath of that fateful HOA meeting felt almost surreal. We had won, but it didn't feel like a victory in the traditional sense. The battle had taken its toll on me, on my neighbors, and on the community itself. But the truth was, we had done something incredible. We had taken back our rights from a system that had grown so corrupt, so detached from the needs of the people it was supposed to serve, that it no longer even resembled the community organization it was meant to be. The vote had passed, and the first real crack in Karen's iron grip on the HOA had formed. The board had agreed to review its policies, and Karen, who had once seemed invincible, now found herself on the defensive. But the real turning point came after the meeting, when the community came together to demand change. The fallout. In the days following the meeting, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. People who had been afraid to speak out for years were finally emboldened, sharing their stories and frustrations with one another. Neighbors who had been silently suffering under Karen's reign now had a collective voice, and they weren't afraid to use it. The change was palpable, even in the quietest corners of the neighborhood. As for Karen, her authority crumbled almost overnight. She had been the face of the HOA for years, but after the vote, she was suddenly just another resident in the community. A woman whose power had been stripped away by the very people she had tried to control. The next few days were a whirlwind of emails, meetings, and more than a few tense conversations. The HOA board was forced to open up a forum for the residents, a sort of town hall-style meeting where we could openly discuss the future of the HOA and any proposed reforms. And while Karen was still involved in the process, it was clear that her influence had waned considerably. Her usual smug confidence was replaced with a more defensive, almost desperate energy. She tried to push back against the vote, claiming that the HOA's bylaws made it impossible to make immediate changes, but she couldn't deny the truth. The residents were now fully aware of the way she had been running things, and they weren't going to let her get away with it anymore. The reforms. As the days turned into weeks, things began to change for the better. The new HOA meetings were more inclusive, and the previously draconian rules started to be reviewed with a more open and fair perspective. The board began working with the community rather than ruling over it. They reviewed the fines, reconsidered the enforcement policies, and even implemented a system where homeowners could appeal decisions before fines were issued. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The most important change, however, was the introduction of term limits for HOA board members. No one could hold power for an indefinite period, and board members were now elected by a majority vote from the residents. This new system would ensure that no one, like Karen, could remain in a position of unchecked authority for too long. As for the fines, they were restructured to be more reasonable and equitable. Instead of minor issues leading to hefty penalties, there was now a tiered system based on the severity of the violation. Homeowners were also encouraged to communicate with the board before fines were handed out, fostering a spirit of cooperation rather than animosity. It was a huge step in the right direction, and I could see the difference almost immediately. People were happier, they felt empowered, and most importantly, they felt respected. Karen's fall. Despite the reforms, Karen's reputation in the community was permanently damaged. While she remained on the board for a short time, she was increasingly marginalized. Her behavior at the meetings became more erratic, her arguments less convincing. The other board members, who had once followed her every command, now began to distance themselves from her. No one wanted to be associated with the old guard. One evening, after one particularly heated meeting where Karen had tried to block the term limit proposal, she quietly resigned from the board. She didn't even announce it in a public forum. She just sent an email to the remaining members and disappeared from the scene. The email read something like this: "Due to recent events, I've decided to step down as president of the HOA. I no longer wish to serve in a position where my leadership is questioned. I trust that you'll make the right decisions moving forward." It was a cowardly exit, but one that was long overdue. No longer was she the woman who had lorded over the neighborhood with her petty rules and unjust fines. Karen's reign was over. A new era for the community. With Karen gone, the neighborhood began to heal. People who had been afraid to stand up to the HOA began to show up at meetings, voice their concerns, and engage in the process. It was no longer a place where residents were just passive participants. It was a place where we all had a say, where every voice mattered. I, too, had changed. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first moved into the neighborhood. The battle with the HOA had opened my eyes to the power of collective action, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the necessity of holding those in power accountable. I had found my voice, and I was never going to let anyone take it away from me again. In the months that followed, the neighborhood flourished. People repaired their homes, fixed up their lawns, and worked together to improve the shared spaces. We even held a neighborhood barbecue, where the new HOA board, one that was transparent, collaborative, and focused on the well-being of the residents, gave a speech thanking everyone for their involvement. The sense of unity was stronger than it had ever been before. The ironic twist. But the story didn't end there. About 6 months later, Karen attempted to make a comeback. She had moved out of the neighborhood and bought a house in a nearby town, but it wasn't long before she was seen trying to campaign for a seat on the local HOA board in her new community. The irony of it all wasn't lost on anyone. "Do you think they'll let her back in?" Bob asked when he heard the news. "No chance," I replied, chuckling. "I think her reputation precedes her now." It was true. Karen was now the face of what every HOA board member shouldn't be. She had become the embodiment of the very thing we had fought against, and her future in the HOA world was essentially over. Her attempts to return to power were laughed off by the community, and she quickly became a cautionary tale for anyone thinking of trying to push their weight around in a neighborhood. TLVDR. The victory was bittersweet, but in the end, the HOA was reformed. Karen's reign of terror ended with her resignation, and the neighborhood began to thrive under a more transparent and fair system. The new board listened to the community, and the reforms they implemented gave residents real power. As for Karen, her reputation was irreparably damaged, and her future attempts to regain power were laughed off by her new community. The battle had been hard, but the neighborhood had emerged stronger, united, and empowered.